Okay, hi, welcome to lecture 6 in our animal rights law course. Today we are going to be talking about the philosophical foundations of animal rights. Now, why are we talking about philosophy at all? This is a law faculty. Animal rights, as we saw, and as we will be seeing in the coming lectures, they don't really exist yet. A lot of it is basically theories as to how they could look if they existed. There's a couple of cases that we'll be talking about, but for the most part, they only exist in theory so far. And that is why looking into the philosophy is really important, because it's been mostly the philosophers who have been talking about, who have been trying to imagine what animal rights could look like, and why animals should have rights, should have moral worth, basically. So what we're doing today is look at the philosophical debates that exist, the different philosophical approaches to animal rights, before we will then look into the more legal questions in the coming weeks. But really the philosophical debates are the foundation on which legal animal rights are currently being built. So that's why it's important to consider those foundations. Here's an outline of our lecture. We will start by looking into Peter Singer's utilitarian approach to animal rights, Peter Singer being perhaps one of the most famous thinkers, ethicists, when it comes to animals. We will then turn to an approach that was developed in response to Peter Singer, and that's Tom Regan's deontological approach or rights approach to animal ethics. There's also Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach that we will be discussing, before turning to a more critical take on animal rights by Carol Adams, who developed a feminist approach to animal ethics. And then finally, we will also look at a view that is critical of granting animals any moral consideration, or at least any direct moral consideration, as we will see. Now, of course, there's more philosophical outlooks out there. The lecture handout contains more varied, partly also more niche approaches to animals that we can find in the literature. What we want to do today is really just focus on some of the key, the most important philosophical traditions. But just so you know, there's more out there. There's a more diverse range of approaches, and the lecture handout will give you a good starting point if you're interested in any of those. Okay, let us start now with what might arguably be the most important, at least as far as its impact is concerned, approach to animal ethics, and that's Peter Singer's utilitarian approach. You'll probably all have heard of Animal Liberation, the book. Maybe some of you have read it. A book that was published in 1975. Peter Singer refined his approach in some of his later books, such as Practical Ethics, but really Animal Liberation is still the Bible of the animal ethics, animal liberation movement, if you like. But what exactly does this book tell us? Animal Liberation is a book that is based on a utilitarian approach to ethics, or to moral philosophy, if you like. What does utilitarianism say? We already encountered utilitarianism last week, if you remember, when we looked at Jeremy Bentham, who was one of the early utilitarians. Basically, utilitarians say that an act is good or wrong depending on its consequences, concretely, depending on whether it maximizes utility or pleasure, if you like. Or it minimizes, that's the other sort of way of looking at it, it minimizes pain or maximizes utility. They're just the other side of the same coin. Peter Singer, for much of his career, was a so-called preference utilitarian, basically meaning that he wanted to maximize the preferences, what sentient beings prefer. He's now an act utilitarian, and they say act in whatever way you can as to maximize utility. The difference is minor for our purposes. It doesn't matter much, but just so you know that he sort of changed his view. But the main thing being he is a utilitarian. Now, what sort of implications, conceptual implications, does he draw from this utilitarian approach that he's adopting? Perhaps the main one, the one that you will have come across in the chapter that was assigned for today, is this idea, this principle of equal consideration of interests. What does this principle tell us exactly? The equal consideration of interests principle says that when you have two beings, being A and being B, and if they're both sentient, then you should treat them in the exact same way, regardless of their species, right? So if being A happens to be a human being, and if being B happens to be a rat, say, that should not make a difference in how we treat them as far as pain and pleasure is concerned, because they're beings that are equally able to suffer from pain. We should not focus on whether they are rational beings, whether they are beings that have the ability to speak in English or in some other language. The only thing that matters is whether they can suffer. Right? This, I'm sure, will remind you of the Bentham quote that we had on the slides last week. You know, what really matters is, can they suffer? Right? So Singer is really following in Bentham's tradition here and emphasizes this ability to suffer, this sentience. So treat a being in the same way if it is the same as far as its sentience is concerned. What happens if we violate this principle, which happens very often? What happens is we become speciesists. We treat beings differently. We treat animals differently from humans, just in virtue of them belonging to a different species, them not being human, even though they might have the exact same capacity to suffer. That is speciesism, according to Singer. He defines it as follows in analogy with sexism and racism. He says, racists violate the principle of equality, this equal consideration of interest principle, by giving greater weight to the interests of members of their own race when there's a clash between their interests and the interests of those of another race. Sexists, likewise, violate the principle of equality by favoring the interests of their own sex. And then similarly, speciesists allow the interests of their own species to override the greater interests of members of other species, this being the key part here. So he says here that the way in which speciesism works is exactly the same as with sexism and racism. It's just about being a member of a different species rather than being a member of a different race or different sex. But the logic behind the oppression, if you like, is exactly the same. Now, there's some caveats that we need to add here. Singer is not a theory of animal rights in the strict sense, even though he's often sort of said to be the father of the animal rights movement. That is only true in a very loose sense. And the reason for this is the very fact that Singer is a utilitarian. Utilitarianism, as we saw, tells you that you should do whatever maximizes overall happiness or utility. If you have to violate someone's rights to maximize utility, then you have to do it. This is what's morally required. So utilitarianism has real difficulties accommodating the concept of a right, because it always allows the right to be overridden when the utility, the overall utility requires it. Take the quote that Singer had in one of his books, where he says, "I certainly would never deny that we are justified in using animals for human goals." So he's not opposed to animal farming per se, to scientific experimentation per se, to other ways of using animals. He says, because as a consequentialist, which is another way here of saying I'm a utilitarian, I must also hold that in the appropriate circumstances we are justified in using humans to achieve human goals or the goal of assisting animals. I'm not the kind of moral absolutist who holds that the end can never justify the means. Right? So he's telling us here, in the same way as he thinks that in the human context we can sometimes override someone's interests if the community benefits from it, basically, so can we in the animal context use animals if it maximizes overall utility. We're not granting anyone rights, because if we do so, we're no longer allowed to override their interests if we really need to. We might take the example in the human case of, say, a terrorist who planted a bomb somewhere. Now, can you torture the terrorist to find out where the bomb is? You would violate their rights by torturing them, but you would probably be able to save many people's lives. A utilitarian would think it is fine, broadly speaking, to torture the terrorist because it would increase overall utility, right? Many people would survive, and it's just one person who suffers. So here, the end would justify the means, the torture. So Singer allows for this, and therefore he's not a rights thinker. Also very important for us is that while he thinks that everyone needs to be treated the same as far as their sentience is concerned, he does not conclude from that that all lives have equal worth, equal value. He does not think that animals' lives are worth the same as humans' lives. And the reason is a very similar one to that we already saw in Bentham. Singer believes, and many people agree with him, that for the most part only human beings, or only very few animals, have the ability to plan the future, have a sense of themselves across time, if you like, can remember past events, have a sense of themselves in the present, and can plan for the future, anticipate the future. In other words, only human beings, or mostly only human beings, are persons who have a sense of self-awareness. The focus here is really, can you plan for the future? Do you have an interest in living tomorrow? If it's all the same to you, if it doesn't matter what happens tomorrow, then it's not a problem if we kill you, as long as we do it painlessly. Right? But Singer thinks that most human beings, not all of them, most of human beings are persons, and so they have an interest in being alive, and so their lives matter more than the lives of animals that are merely sentient. So as long as we don't make them suffer, he thinks it's fine that we kill animals for, say, eating them or experimenting on them, as long as they don't suffer in the process. Now again, he's consistent in this. He will say, yes, there's also some human beings that have lives that don't matter as much because they're not persons, maybe because of a mental disability, maybe because they're infants. So he will apply this idea in a sort of consistent fashion, being a utilitarian, but it does mean that on the whole, animals have less value, their lives have less value for him. Okay, now this is Singer. Let's now turn to a very different approach, one in fact that, as I alluded to before, was developed in response to this utilitarian case for animal ethics. And this is Tom Reagan's Case for Animal Rights, the book Case for Animal Rights being the key text. And what this book does is, in response to utilitarianism, it tried to really develop an argument for animal rights, not just animal moral status, if you will, or animal moral considerability as utilitarianism did, but real rights, rights that trump humans' interests in at least some cases. Now, how did Reagan do that? Reagan took a deontological approach, and that's another way of saying a philosophical outlook that says that your action is either good or wrong, depending on whether it follows a set of rules. One sort of classic example is, there's a rule that says you should not kill. It doesn't matter if by respecting that rule, maybe you're not maximizing overall utility. You should not kill regardless of the consequences. There's a set principle, a set rule that you have to respect, and this is what determines whether you act morally in a right or wrong way. Do you follow the rules or not? So as I said, the consequences on this approach do not matter. Certain acts are simply wrong in principle if they are done to someone with inherent value. Now, Reagan gives the example of Aunt Bea to illustrate this. Aunt Bea is a fabulously rich lady, but she's really grumpy, she's really a pain in the ass, no one likes her. She's also quite old, so she's had, a nice life, but she's close to dying anyway, but she's not quite dead yet. Reagan tells us, well, I'm Aunt Bea's nephew. I could really use that money, and I would spend it in a way that would really maximize utility. I would give it to a children's hospital where, say, 1,000 children's lives would be saved by using that money that she has, spending it on the children who are in need. Why am I not allowed to just kill her, inherit the money, and then spend it in this way that really benefits everyone, and she won't really be any worse off because she's very old anyway? As we saw before, Singer's approach, broadly speaking, would allow for this to happen. Right? We could kill Aunt Bea because the benefit would really sort of outweigh the cost inflicted on her. But Reagan here wants to tell us, surely this would be wrong. We wouldn't allow for Aunt Bea to be killed because there are certain principles such as you should not kill. So this is how he goes about animal rights. He wants there to be certain rights that are uninfringible, if you like, regardless of what cost it inflicts on human interests for animals to have particular rights. The focus here is not so much on suffering in Reagan's theory, but it is on a system that doesn't give animals any of these rights and treats them as mere resources and the wrongs that follow from the system. So in this respect, he's quite similar to Francione, whom we discussed last week, who is also a rights thinker, a deontological thinker, if you like, who focuses very much on the system of exploitation as the original sin, the root problem. But Reagan differs from Francione in one key way. Reagan believes that only beings who are what he calls a subject of a life, have inherent value and have a right to life and have the rights that someone like Aunt Bea has. Not everyone has it, only those who are subjects of a life. And importantly, he thinks that once you're in that club of the subject of a life, and we'll see in a minute what exactly this entails, you are an equal to everyone else who is a subject of a life. Right? So we will no longer distinguish between those who have more value in their lives because maybe they have more self-awareness in the way that Singer would hold, as compared to others who might have less self-awareness. So we no longer have this gradation, if you like. Everyone's an equal who is a subject of a life, but who exactly is a subject of a life? Reagan gives us this definition here. He says, subjects of a life are beings who have beliefs and desires, perception, memory, and a sense of the future, an emotional life together with feelings of pleasure and pain, preference and welfare interests, preference interests being the things we prefer. So maybe me eating chocolate, I prefer to eat chocolate, even if maybe it's not in the interest of my welfare, even if I eat too much of it, maybe it's not really good for my health. So that's the difference between a welfare and a preference interest. The ability to initiate action in pursuit of their desires and goals, a psychological identity over time, and an individual welfare in the sense that their experiential life fares well or ill for them, logically independently of their utility for others. So the last sentence being an outright rejection of utilitarianism. But interestingly, what you see in the quote here is Reagan is using quite a similar criterion to the one we saw in Singer in Bentham, the idea that you have to have a sense of time, of the future, of the past, and you need to be able to initiate actions in pursuit of goals that you might achieve in the future. Right? So we have something that's very similar, I believe, to the idea of a self-aware being, one with at least a minimum level of rational capacities, planning for the future, having an interest in remaining alive, in shaping their lives according to their goals. Now, the obvious problem with this definition is, but one that Reagan was willing to accept because it gave him the idea of equal value, some beings are not subjects of a life. And he's absolutely transparent about this. He says, yes, some human beings won't classify as subjects of a life, and some animals won't. He says the line that we will need to draw is probably an arbitrary one, but it can be drawn somewhere. He says probably at the age of 1 at least. So if you're under 1, if you're an infant under 1, then you're not a subject of a life. But then as you become older, you turn into a subject of a life. He says we need to draw a line somewhere. He suggests maybe 1 year old. And he says maybe all mammals, at least, are able to be subjects of a life. They just need to be old enough. If you're not a subject of a life, importantly, we may still owe you some moral consideration, but it's only indirect. You don't have inherent value because you lack all these capacities that give you inherent moral value. We only have indirect duty. So maybe your family really likes you, and if we protect you, they are better off. So that would be a reason to protect you, but not because you matter in and of yourself. That's because you're not yet a subject of a life. Now, what are some of the practical implications of this account? Reagan is committed to the abolition and the use of animals as long as they're subjects of a life, and he believes that most animals used in science, farming, hunting, and other areas are indeed subjects of a life, and therefore they have rights not to be used in those ways. He also thinks that the reason why humans have rights is precisely because they're subjects of a life. And so human rights and animal rights are really based on the same idea, and people defending those ideas are partners in the same type of struggle. They should join forces, if you like. Okay, this is Reagan's account. In this sort of tour d'horizon, and I realize we're moving swiftly through different approaches, but the purpose is just to give you a sense of what different people have been suggesting. The next stop on this tour is Martha Nussbaum, who's an American legal philosopher based at the University of Chicago. Her most famous text is Frontiers of Justice, Disability, Nationality, Species, Membership. She's currently working on a new book on animal justice that's supposed to come out at some point. What Martha Nussbaum does is she talks about ethics, about what's morally right and morally wrong, but she takes a slightly broader approach. It's a theory of justice, if you like, not just ethics, in that it also looks at what we need to do more broadly, perhaps also on a state level, in order to create a just system for all animals, not just how we need to act personally, what are right and wrong acts on a personal level. Specifically, Nussbaum thinks that animals should have the chance to flourish, to live out their capabilities, what they're able to do based on their species. And why is that something she's keen on? She thinks that as interesting and well-intentioned that Singer's approach and Reagan's approach are, they really focus for the most part on suffering, especially in Singer's case. And they neglect the fact that a happy animal life is not just about not suffering. It involves so much more. It involves being able to run around freely. It involves physical achievement, she says. It involves maybe being able to grieve for a dead child, thinking of maybe a cow whose calf is taken away. These are all ways of expressing what the animal is. And if we restrict that, if we don't allow the animal to express this, we are limiting it. It's not just about suffering per se. We need to take a broader view. Specifically, she thinks that every species, although there will be overlaps, of course, has their own capabilities. She's taking an Aristotelian approach here, where what a good life for a cat is, for instance, is not quite the same as what a good life for a pig is. There will be overlaps. Both of them don't want to suffer. But cats can do cat things. Pigs can do pig things. And we need to allow them to develop and express those capabilities that they have. Now, what about, say, predators? Should we just allow predators to run around freely and kill their prey because that's their capability? Nussbaum argues that we will have to do some selecting. We should only promote capabilities that are good, that don't harm others, and that are central. Right? You might say, cats have the capability of scratching sofas. But that's probably not something we should promote, because even if it was good, it's definitely not something that's central to their lives, right? In the way that maybe running around outdoors would be, or having, healthy nutrition would be. Now, Nussbaum drafts a list of 10 capabilities that basically she developed in the human context with Amartya Sen, famous economist, and she transplanted into the animal context. My personal hunch is that you'll probably update this list because it is still quite sort of human focused, but here goes. So she says animals have, first of all, the capability of life. So they should be entitled to continue their lives. Euthanasia should only occur in limited circumstances, not just because we feel like putting down, say, a healthy dog. Animals have a capability of bodily health, she says. So that basically requires laws banning cruel treatment and neglect. She also says animals have the capability of bodily integrity. This is quite close, I think, to number 2, but she seems to be getting at things here also that might not be painful in the strict sense as limiting health or interfering with health, but that might overall still be an interference with the integrity of the animal. I think she gives the example of declawing of cats, assuming that that's not painful, which it might be. Senses, imagination, and thought. So animals should have the ability to run around freely in an environment that stimulates and pleases the senses, she says. There should be laws giving them access to light, space, and all that, so they can develop those senses. Emotions. Animals should be able and entitled to love and care for others. So think of social animals, perhaps, where they are not allowed to be with other animals of their kind. Practical reason. Now that's a one that to me smacks really of sort of a human list of capabilities, but she says that we need to ask also to what extent the creature, maybe thinking of chimps and some animals with perhaps more developed intellectual capacities, whether they can in fact plan for their future, and that we should allow them to live out those plans. Affiliation, the idea here to also engage again with other members of your species, including also humans. This one here, I think, refers particularly to members of other animal species. So being able to, maybe, cats and dogs, form friendships, play, it's pretty obvious. And then control over one's environment. Here she gives the example of animals should have human guardians with standing to go to court to vindicate these entitlements and these protections of capability. So controlling their environment in this sense. Okay. Let us now turn to an approach that is more critical of animal rights, albeit still in favor of protecting animals. And that's Carol Adams' feminist care approach. Adams published two really important books, The Sexual Politics of Meat, which is depicted here on the slide, and Neither Man Nor Beast, which was published a few years later. The starting point of Adams's philosophy is that systems of oppression, systems of domination, she says, they are not separate. They often overlap in ways that create what is often called an intersectionality. There are overlaps between different systems of oppression. And if we don't realize that, we don't understand that you can only take down oppression by attacking it on all different fronts, if you like. Just to give one example, using the picture here on the cover, a point that Adams makes is sexism is often very much connected with speciesism, right? The woman here is depicted in a sexualized way, and this overlaps also with speciesism because, as you can see, she's sort of got the different, parts of the flesh marked on her body. So at the same time, you have basically an objectification of a woman here and the objectification of an animal as something that we can eat, right? And there being also this sexual connotation component to it. The book has lots of really striking illustrations like this that Adams came across over the course of her career. On the internet too, you can find many good examples along those lines that illustrate what she's trying to say here. So because sexism, because racism, because speciesism overlap, we need to tackle them together. Now, Adams is also critical of dualisms, which she thinks are typical of a liberal rights framework and typical of current systems of domination. These dualisms always oppose one thing to another. So you have the dualism man-woman, where the thing on the left side of the binary usually has sort of positive connotations, and the one on the right side is seen in contrast, in a negative contrast to the first one. And these dualisms often overlap also. So you have man-woman overlapping with rational, emotional, where emotional is seen as a negative thing, rational being the positive thing. And in the same way, you have the dualism of the human and the animal, right? She's very critical of these dualisms because they always create an other, the one that's on the right side of the binary that is seen in a negative light. Now, what's problematic with animal rights, Adams argues, is that it precisely creates such a dualism. It doesn't get rid of the binary thinking. What animal rights does, she says, is it just redraws the line, essentially. It extends rights and personhood, but it excludes it from those that don't meet a certain criterion, for instance, sentience or subject of a life. Or pick your favorite philosophical approach and reason for why animals should have rights. There's always someone who's going to be excluded from it because they lack the relevant criterion. And she thinks that's just typical of a sort of liberal and also male approach to ethics, to philosophy. Now, what's the alternative? Adam sketches a care ethics as an alternative to this traditional way of thinking about humans and animals and ethics more broadly. And I've tried in this table here to sort of sketch out the differences between these two different frameworks, intellectual frameworks. The table that you can see here. Let's start with the traditional ethics. So the method that it applies is usually a universalist one. It says, if you're a sentient being, then the principle of equal consideration applies to you regardless of where on Earth, in the universe, basically you are, right? There's some abstract principles that we can just apply anywhere, and they tell us what we should do, morally speaking. Or maybe the criterion and subject of a life. Regardless of where you are in the universe, if you're a subject of life, you have certain rights. Adams rejects this and says, no, we should take a context-based approach to what we ought to do, morally speaking. So she says, there's a difference between someone being, say, a member of my family and what I ought to do, say, for my child and the responsibilities I have for my child, than, say, my responsibilities for a chimpanzee living somewhere in the forest or a human person living maybe in North America somewhere. Yes, there are some things that potentially we owe them, but we have to look at the context. We cannot make universal judgments. So there's a different method here that is applied in care ethics. In contrast to traditional ethics, which is very much focused usually on the individual and the individual's rights, individual also often being seen in the disembodied way, basically meaning we don't very much focus on their bodies. We look more at, say, rational capacities, self-awareness. Does the being have the self-awareness? Thinking of Singer here, for instance. She says care ethics basically is better because it sees individuals as being dependent on others. There's no individual who can survive on their own. We are all dependent on others in some forms, on our families, our mothers, fathers, brothers, and other human beings in our community, perhaps also other animals. We cannot do ethics if we ignore that fact. Also, we should see ourselves as very much embodied beings who like to have contact with others, who are not just abstract categories, reason-based thinkings, beings that only think but don't feel, if you like. Systems of oppression, we talked about that one already. Traditional ethics, she suggests, sees them as either separable, that is, you can just focus on animal rights, say, you don't need to tackle sexism at the same time. There are separable projects, or causes, if you like. Or, as happens in many approaches, she believes, these overall systems are neglected, they're ignored, and we just focus on, say, the individual suffering. I think this one is particularly aimed at utilitarianism. Care ethics, by contrast, sees these as interconnected. It's the idea of intersectionality that we saw before, and as being really central. So we need to tackle the system in order to create a more just world. We can't just focus on the individual sufferings because we would ignore the root causes. And then finally, traditional ethics, and we'll be seeing more of this in the coming weeks, values similarities. So you see that a lot in animal rights, basically. If, the standard is you need to be a person to have habeas corpus protection, for instance, then we're always going to try to see if animals are similar to humans in having personhood and therefore being able to get habeas corpus protection. She thinks that's problematic because we're always trying to sort of anthropomorphize animals. We're always trying to make them as similar as we can to ourselves, rather than trying to value what's different in them. The fact that they have so many fascinating abilities that we don't have, but we basically don't value because we don't have them and we don't see them as something valuable. So she and the care ethics approach focuses rather on differences. Okay, that's Adams. Let us now turn to our last approach. And this one here is not just skeptical of animal rights and proposes a different pro-animal framework, if you will. but it is one that says that animals don't really have a place in morality, full stop. And that's Peter Carruthers' contractualism. Contractualism is arguably perhaps one of the other big philosophical approaches aside from consequentialism and deontology, potentially virtue ethics, which we didn't discuss much today. But contractualism says that an action is morally good or wrong if it conforms to a contract that was concluded between rational agents. Now, the contract doesn't actually have to be, written. People didn't actually have to meet for this. It's a hypothetical idea. If rational agents were to conclude a contract and decide on what are the moral rules governing our community, and what would they look like? If they say an action is wrong, then it is wrong. And that's the only standard. There's no external standard. What causes pleasure, what is wrong in itself, doesn't apply. The only thing that matters is what those rational agents would agree on. Now, the key problem, of course, that animals would face in this type of approach is that they're often not viewed as rational agents. And as a result, Carruthers says, well, they could not be part of the contract, right? They could, importantly, not reciprocate someone else's rights by fulfilling a duty. They don't have the ability to do that, and therefore they cannot benefit directly from the contract. The only thing we can give them, and that's similar to what we saw in Reagan for beings that aren't subjects of a life, are indirect duties, right? So maybe they matter for other reasons, not inherently, but indirectly. He says there's two indirect reasons he can think of for why we should protect animals, morally speaking. The first one is, maybe it would cause offense to another rational agent if we maybe tortured their animal, right? So if I have a dog, I'm a rational agent, then I would be really upset if someone tortured my dog. According to Carruthers, the reason then to protect the dog is not because the dog suffers, but because it will cause offense to me as a rational agent, member of the contract, if you like. Second reason, he says, is that if we don't protect the animal, it might make us more inclined to maybe also violate other rational agents' rights. So this is an argument that goes back very far. Kant already defended this view. You can still find it today. The idea that if we're cruel to animals, then we're also more likely to be cruel to humans. Right? And so we would then have to protect animals, not because they're worthy of protection in themselves, but because in so doing we would protect ourselves, and we're the ones who are worthy of protection in this framework. What's the practical upshot of this? Carruthers is very blunt. He says, there is no basis on this contractualist approach for extending moral protection to animals beyond that which is already provided. So he thinks the welfare laws we've been discussing previous weeks, they're absolutely fine. Because in particular, he says, there are no good moral grounds for forbidding, say, hunting, factory farming, or laboratory testing, scientific experiments on animals, because they're not members of the contract, right? They can only benefit from these indirect duties. So unless your dog happens to be, hunted by someone, there's really no reason to protect these animals. There's no direct reason. Now, the question is, could this argument not backfire? Because there's clearly also some human beings who are not or not yet rational agents, maybe infants, maybe senile persons, maybe persons with mental disabilities. Does that not undermine Carruthers' argument? He thinks not, and I'll let you be the judge of whether you think these arguments are compelling. He says, no, the argument doesn't apply in the human context, because if we allowed these sorts of practices on non-rational humans, maybe children, it would lead to a slippery slope undermining rational agents' rights. Right? He says, well, they're all part of the same species, and it's sometimes difficult to draw the line between who's rational and who isn't. So once we try to draw that line, it can get us into really problematic territory. So let's not do that, slippery slope. And then secondly, he says, well, even if maybe there was a clear way of distinguishing the rational from the non-rational humans, it will create social instability. There would be, rebellions on the street. People would be really upset if we started factory farming children. So that is why the argument doesn't apply in the human context. I have my doubts as to how convincing these arguments are, but I'll invite you to think about it on your own, or indeed talk about it in the discussion. Some conclusions for us here. As we saw, there's many different philosophical approaches to why animals matter. Some take a liberation approach, Singer, some take a rights approach, Reagan, some take a care approach, Adams. And some indeed are opposed to the idea of moral rights for animals or moral protection for animals. But I think despite the fact that people like Carruthers exist, and I'm not sure how old he is exactly, there is widespread agreement, I would say, that animals matter morally. Especially, most people, I think, find this argument quite compelling because they're sentient. Now, that doesn't mean that, morally speaking, we have to give sentient animals the same protection as human beings. There's disagreement on how high the level of protection should be, but I think it's not contentious to say that there is agreement that because they're sentient, they deserve some moral consideration, at least direct moral consideration, not just indirect, as Carruthers was suggesting. And then finally, as important as these moral discussions are on animal rights, because they are the foundation and they are what a lot of animal legal rights scholars and courts are picking up on, moral rights are not yet legal rights. Right? Legal rights are often inspired by moral arguments, but they are independent and they rely on judicial constructs, on fictions, on other things that are separate from what these philosophers are talking about. So it is also important to keep that in mind. We're not just going to copy-paste moral rights if we're doing animal rights law. We need to consider the legal aspects on their own merits, and that's what we will be focusing on in the coming weeks. Now with that, I think we can end the lecture, and if there's any questions or comments, I'd be happy to chat about them now. Thank you.